Les Misérables by Victor Hugo. Introduction by Norman Denny. Part 2. The brothers Goncourt, at that time the high priests of literature in France, were not impressed by Les Misérables. The lack of first-hand observation, they wrote, is everywhere painfully manifest. Hugo has built his book, situation and characters alike, on the appearance of reality, not on reality itself. This was their conclusion after reading the first volume. Having read the whole book, they likened the author to those English preachers who harangue strollers in the parks on a Sunday. Professor Marie-Francois Guillard, from whose meticulously edited and annotated text, Garnier Frères, 1963, this translation has been made, and to whom the present translator is immensely indebted, answers the Goncourts by citing some of the novel's more unforgettable characters, Jean Valjean, the Thénardier, Fantine, Javert, and, above all, the splendid street urchin, Gavroche. He is silent, however, on the subject of Marius, the singularly lackluster young man who is supposedly a portrait of the youthful Victor Hugo himself. The Goncourts were both right and wrong, right in the narrow sense, but not in the large one. They were right about the realism which Hugo strove so laboriously and, on the whole, so unsuccessfully to achieve. No one could have worked harder at it. He read and read. He pored endlessly over maps and documents, and the fruits of his researches so encumber his book that many readers, beside the Goncourts, must have found themselves unequal to the effort of pursuing it. But this factual realism is constantly at war with the poet. Imaginative realism is another matter. Les Misérables, with its depth of vision and underlying truth, its moments of lyrical quality and of moving compassion, is a novel of towering stature. One of the great works of Western literature, a melodrama that is also a morality and a social document embracing a wider field than any other novel of its time, conceived on the scale of War and Peace, but even more ambitious. That is the trouble. The defects which the Goncourts saw, and which no one can fail to see, since they are as monumental as the book itself, may be summed up in the single word, extravagance. Hugo, although as the final result shows he was masterly in the construction of his novel, had little or no regard for the discipline of novel writing. He was wholly unrestrained and unsparing of his reader. He had to say everything and more than everything. He was incapable of leaving anything out. The book is loaded down with digressions, interpolated discourses, passages of moralizing rhetoric, and pedagogic disquisitions. One reason for this is that it was written over a period of nearly 20 years. A first unfinished novel entitled Misérables was written during the 3 years from 1845 to 1848. It was then put aside for 12 years, to be completed in 1860 to 62 as Les Misérables. An untranslatable title. The first meaning of the French misère is simply misery. The second meaning is utmost poverty, destitution. But Hugo's Misérables are not merely the poor and wretched, they are the outcasts, the underdogs, the rejected society, and the rebels against society. As to the digressions, many of them are in fact interpolations. Much had happened in the world during the 12 years that the book had laid aside, and much had happened to Hugo himself. He had moved steadily away from his right-wing bourgeoisie origins to the point where he was not only an avowed Republican, but could openly proclaim himself a socialist. It is not surprising that the earlier work required considerable amendment if it was to conform to the changed viewpoint of the Hugo who returned to it in 1860. But some of the discretions, or interpolations, are still indefensible. The most flagrant being the account of the Battle of Waterloo, which occupies the third book of Part 2. It is subdivided into 19 chapters, filling 69 pages of the closely printed French text, and only the last chapter, 7 pages long, has any real bearing on Hugo's history. The rest is entirely concerned with the battle. Hugo, as he tells us, had trampled over the battlefield, presumably when he was living in Brussels in 1853. He had studied maps and army lists and such professional records as were available to him, and out of this he concocted his own elaborate and poeticized layman's version of an event which, tremendous though it was, had no more to do with the story of Les Misérables than any other major historical event that had occurred during the century. This is the largest of the discretions, and it is reasonable to assume that the bulk of it was written long before Hugo returned to his novel. The present English version had retained it, very slightly abridged, in the place it occupies in the novel, partly because it is a magnificent piece of writing, and also because the episode described in the final chapter is crucial to the story. 2 other long digressions, however, have been treated with less respect. The first is in the 7th book of Part 2, entitled Parenthesis, in which Hugo discourses upon the subject of strictly enclosed religious orders, of which he disapproved. He himself, although he was broadly and sincerely religious, subscribed to no particular orthodoxy. This parenthesis follows immediately upon another, the meticulous and fascinating account of life in the Petit Picpus convent. To that the story, at a highly dramatic point, is left in mid-air for some 50 pages. Hugo's publisher, Lacroix, feeling that this would be trying the reader's patience altogether too high, urged him to take it out. But Hugo refused, as it seems for purely personal reasons. His cousin Marie, to whom he was attached, had taken the veil in 1848. This section had accordingly been removed from the body of the book and transferred to the end as Appendix A. The discourse on Argot, Book 7, Part 4, has been similarly treated and is relegated to Appendix B in Volume 2. Here little explanation is needed, insofar as it related directly to the argot, Paris underworld slang, of Hugo's day. His discourse, with its numerous examples, can be of interest only to specialists. Where it spreads into the wider field of general significance of thieves' cant, a discretion within a discretion, it is more interesting, but in any event it does nothing to advance the story. The other discretions, homilies and disquisitions, or simply over-large elaborations, have been left where they were. But in some cases, particularly those of over-elaboration, they have been somewhat abridged. And here I must abandon any suggestion of the editorial "we," and state as plainly as I can my personal approach to the translation of Les Misérables, and the liberties I have felt justified in taking with Hugo's text.